On top of this, the lack of competence within society also leads to the lack of knowledge about the amount of energy that is actually lost due to transmission design from these nuclear power plants. This could relate to technology's rapid pace, or technology proceeding too fast. Because of this, the design is not even close to efficient. When energy is produced within the system, 65% of the energy is lost as heat. This has to do with many instances such as the nuclear rods and the output of each sub-entity. When the electricity is generated, it converts it from low voltage to high voltage in order to be transmitted, but through the transmission process, there's also another 5 to 8% of the energy lost. After it gets to the New York network grid, which we saw in each of the power plant slides above, it is converted back to low voltage so that residential and commercial buildings can accept the amount of power. So when it gets to its appropriate destination and the user flips on the switch, only 22 to 30% of the original fuel reaches that destination. This is almost an 80% decrease in energy, leading to an enormous amount of natural resources. It relates to the article on waste heat. When an individual looks at the smokestacks on energy generation centers, that's wasted heat. Heat that can produce an amount of energy that could, on its own, power another separate New York City. If we use natural resources, how could we design our technologies to be more efficient? How could we design without natural resources, period? Because of the unintended consequences, or we could say, the production of technology that happened too fast, 30 years after its integration as a major energy producer, people are now becoming aware and taking charge to put a stop to nuclear energy production, and in this case, Indian Point Power Plant. The debate about whether Indian Point should stay open and productive or be closed as told by ThomasNet.com is to the right. One of the biggest issues that is pinpointed is the fact that this nuclear production site is about 25 miles away from New York City. If a disaster were to happen, New York City would clearly be the toxic zone and massive evacuation would have to happen, which is nearly impossible at a quick rate. The other point that individuals are finally noticing is that if Indian Point were to cease production, it would decrease the power reserves from 14.5 to 8.4%. In a perfect situation, 18% is suggested. If it becomes this low, prices will rise from 13% to 25%, leading to about $1 billion increase in the next 3 to 4 years. Also, more likelihood for blackouts will occur. Because a new energy production process that incorporates green technology is not yet known, the rate of revival, or recovery, if it is to be shut down, is unknown. However, what is known is that over 3,000 jobs will be lost due to this event. This is the thing that will get to individuals the most. Even though the site might be potentially dangerous, is it worth losing your well-paid to high-paid job over? The risk of disaster has also been significantly advanced. The report to the side from ABC tells that a new fault line for earthquakes has been found and lies within miles from Indian Point Energy Center. It is actually 25 miles from it. Because the site was built 30 years ago, it was not implemented with substantial earthquake barriers that would keep it intact. Therefore, after a major earthquake years ago, an additional layer of reinforcements were added to each of the nuclear reactors. However, the nuclear plant can still only survive in earthquakes up to 6.5 magnitude. The report says that with the new fault line, it is likely that we could see a magnitude of 6.0 earthquake quite soon. On top of this, they also report that an earthquake larger than 6.5 has a 40% chance of happening within the next decade and a half. With this type of risk associated with the plant, it makes the individuals think about what is more prominent, a higher price and a safer environment to live in, or an environment at risk with lower costs. The debate is underway. How will engineers decide what should be left for a type of energy production and what shouldn't? The best way to develop a solution to this potential disaster is to decompose the problems that are present in the site. That is why I included a plan drawing in this slide. The 3 nuclear reactors are shown, as well as where the water begins to integrate into the system and the energy is processed and then transmitted. So we can begin to ask the question now of, is it time to start redesigning smaller entities within a nuclear production site? Or should we completely redesign the whole facility? So on the next slide, if we start looking at what happens in each reactor consists of a large pressure vessel. that has numerous amounts of nuclear control rods. These rods contain elements of uranium-235, often called weapons-grade uranium. When the uranium is actively moving around the vessel, they collide in order to produce nuclear fusion. This is the product that produces the energy, and it is also the product that leads to hazardous waste. However, this is the energy that will then be transmitted to individuals that are included in the network system. Lastly, in order to cool the system, water, like shown in the last slide, is being pushed into the vessel to cool down the control rods. After multiple repeating processes, the uranium is then deposited and named waste, whose proper location has yet to be discovered. Some say it's on the side of a mountain, and others say there is no chance of it ever being regarded as waste. So throughout looking at the process of this production, the hazards that exist with this system, and also the amount of pressure it would put on the economy if this system was not to exist at all, the overall input from the individuals within society is represented in the graph to the right. This graph shows different greens that portray how individuals feel about nuclear power. There was an increase in people that said that nuclear power is too dangerous and they should all be closed down immediately. Also, there was an increase saying that we should use the existing nuclear plants but should not build new ones. This category was less than the first 15%. This category is represented in this green, and the other category that I just mentioned is represented in this green. Having this graph just begs the question that I think should be implemented from an architecture student's perspective. I'd say that nuclear power plants should be used while undergoing new forms of architectural concepts that would redetermine the energy production system. I believe that with the integration of the 8 categories to the right, namely that a new type of advanced energy production could actually become developed with the integration of all of these systems. So, we have to ask ourselves another question like the rest. What do you think the active renovation should look like? Which categories do you think should be implemented? So, if you were to not implement the categories that I suggested in the last slide, you would have the same feedback loop that is seen in this slide. It leads to disasters such as Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima. Natural resources that are implemented in factories to produce products create pollution and contamination, as well as a lot of wasted product. This then leads to unhealthy environments and multiple sick people. You can see this process as we move on to this feedback. Because there is no connection between unhealthy people and natural resources, we put a big X through this last arrow, and essentially name this whole loop destructive feedback loop, because it does nothing constructive and there's no connection between the last two, whether it is nuclear or coal or something else. This is the destructive feedback loop that is seen in these environments. A high use of natural resources that move through systems that use water and then transmit the product to the people. It leads to the same thing. So this is essentially the same feedback loop. The chart that is present on this page is a chart that represents a path that Indian Point nuclear energy production could exhibit. With these implementations, it could produce its own feedback system that could lead us to a healthier environment. If the biggest challenge with Indian Point is that innovation proceeds too fast, a barrier to overcoming that would be technological somnambulism, like it was described in the above slides. Ways that could reorganize productive innovation are built-in flexibility and the burden of proof, so that if a disastrous product were to be built, it could be easily manipulated after, or maybe 30 years down the line, like nuclear energy plant. These products would also be tested for levels of toxicity before they were even released to the public, being the burden of proof implementation. All of these would be tested, and if they were tested negatively, they wouldn't be marketed. Some economic and political innovations to steer the example in a more dominant path would be to provide society with competence. Having everyone understand the functionality of a certain technology leads to an overall better knowledge and a better product. Lastly, technoscientists could also start to undergo their education and their professional practices by becoming more aware of dangers and protecting against these innovations. They could approach their work with the mindset of minimizing health threats to humans and as well as the environment. So a big thing that we could do as engineers, architects, and individuals that belong to society is to reproduce this destructive feedback loop in order for it to redevelop into what is seen to the right. So this constructive feedback loop affords the examples that were seen above as the types of definitions that would lead to something more safe and healthy. A productive feedback loop that exists from everyone's competence and that looks at saving the environment through the use of green technologies. The result will be a new integration of 21st century energy production that, with the first stab, could have to do with the integration of the newly recognized system, microbial fuel cells with reverse electrodialysis. This is an extremely conceptual process at the moment. However, the old site could include cells that create energy through the integration of fresh water, salt water, and bacterial activity that is usually found in soil from vegetation. By using rainwater collection features, the Hudson River's semi-salinated water that could become more salinated with ammonium bicarbonate, and vegetation features that intermingle throughout the process could be achieved. And this is a look into the actual thesis project that is now being undergone. So with this system, it could possibly lead to a new type of engineering and a new possibility for the old nuclear energy production centers. All of those systems produce a high amount of toxicity, and Indian Point is at the base of all of them. The amount of toxic that comes from that system is enormous. So, with the system again, through these two videos that are being portrayed on this slide, this last slide, we see the two very different ways we could approach the system. It is essentially a metaphorical connection portrayed between the two videos. And the video on the left, complete desolation of the system. So essentially not touching the actual location at all and letting Indian Point Power Plant just become an old ruin. Or the video on the right becoming a living machine that produces safe and healthy energy through a new type of way, whether it is through microbial systems or it is through something completely different. A completely different type of energy come to life. On the left, environment that is completely desolated actually becoming destroyed, and on the right, the system is actually becoming overwhelmed by these living vines and these living things, and that could possibly represent a new society. So what do you think? As a member of society, what would you do in order to reverse the negative effects of nuclear energy production?